part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ben Billman. On this episode of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast, we will be taking a look at the recently introduced AP Top 25, which basically signals the start of the college basketball season. And in the second half, I will be choosing the 5 most overrated, the 5 most underrated teams in the top 25, followed by 5 teams that did not make it into the first poll, which I believe should have been there. So let's start with a review of the AP Top 25. Once again, the voters come into this looking at who's gone, who came in as freshmen, and now the challenging part is looking at who came in through the transfer portal. It's a lot more difficult nowadays to determine as voters who should be in the top 25 because so much of what's going to happen this year is going to have to be team development and building of culture within these programs. Coaches have more difficulty than ever to make that happen, especially at some of these schools where a majority of their roster is completely new to the school. And we'll talk about some of those schools as we go through this top 25. So let's start at the top of the rankings. Number 1 preseason is Kansas. Kansas was a 4 seed last year in the NCAA tournament. They really struggled with injuries last year. They do have Hunter Dickinson coming back, one of the best offensive big men in the country. They also have DeJuan Harris and KJ Adams coming back. And Bill Self is a coach that you never want to bet against when it comes to quality and depth of a program. They start off at number 1. I do have questions about them as far as how good they can get, especially with the defensive lapses that Hunter Dickinson goes through. But overall, I think number 1 is an okay place to put them, and this again is based on a lot of different factors about returning players coming back for them. At number 2, the AP voters put Alabama, a Final Four team from a year ago with one of the best floor generals in college basketball in Mark Sears. Nate Oates has a program that is going to be consistently good for years to come. He's one of the best coaches in the country. And they also brought in Cliff Omoruyi from Rutgers, one of the best big men transfers in the country. Alabama looking for back-to-back trips to the Final Four. At number 3, the UConn Huskies, the 2-time defending national champions. They do lose a lot of pieces from last year. The only returning starter is Alex Caravan, but they're going to have one of the most intriguing freshmen in the country in Liam McNeely. Dan Hurley is, in my opinion, the best coach in college basketball. The culture he is building there at Connecticut is second to none, and it would not surprise me to see the UConn Huskies three-peat, especially with the culture and just the overall coaching intensity that he brings to that team. At number 4, the Houston Cougars, the number 1 seed from last year who fell to Duke in the Sweet 16. The biggest storyline for this team is how are they going to replace the best defensive player in the country last year, Jamal Shead, one of the best leaders on the court that Kelvin Sampson has ever had. They do return LJ Cryer, which is a big deal, but I really question where is this team headed without the leadership and the abilities of Jamal Shead. At number 5 is Iowa State. They were a 2 seed last year. They lost a tough game to Illinois in the Sweet 16. They do have one of the most depth, in my opinion, in college basketball. They're the definition of a team, and TJ Otzelberger is really building something special there at Iowa State. At number 6 is Gonzaga. Gonzaga had a little bit of a down year in terms of what Gonzaga is normally at. They did, though, make it to the Sweet 16 again. Their streak of Sweet 16 appearances is absolutely ridiculous. And Mark Few returned some of the best players in the country in Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, and Graham Ike. All players with experience. I think Gonzaga is better this year than they were last year, and they're definitely in the hunt for Mark Few's third Final Four as the head coach at Gonzaga. At number 7 is Duke, maybe the most intriguing team in the country based on one player, and that is Cooper Flagg. If you follow college basketball at all, Cooper Flagg is going to be a name that is going to be said almost every day on any college basketball show or podcast. He is already projected to be the number 1 pick in next summer's NBA draft. So the hype and the intensity around Duke basketball this year is going to be intense. How is John Shire going to incorporate a player of that talent into a team that has so many high expectations on them heading into this season? At number 8 is Baylor. Scott Drew continues to put together a very well-defined, well-disciplined team. The program at Baylor that he has is just incredible when you think about where they've come from over the years with Scott Drew. They did lose in the second round last year, but they returned VJ Edgecombe, who is one of the highest-ranked rookies or freshmen in the country. Keep an eye on him. And they also get Jeremy Roach from Duke in the transfer portal. I think Baylor is going to have one of the best guard combinations in the country with VJ Edgecombe as a freshman and Jeremy Roach as a transfer. At number 9 is North Carolina. One thing that North Carolina has struggled with under Hubert Davis is bench depth. They always have one of the best starting lineups in the country, but when it comes to second string and bringing guys off the bench, they have struggled mightily with that in recent years. This year they've been able to correct that again a little bit. RJ Davis, one of the best floor generals in the country. I expect good things out of North Carolina, and they sit at number 9. At number 10 is Arizona, making the leap from the Pac-12 over to the Big 12. I expect them and have high expectations for them in the Big 12. I think they're in the top half, if not top third, of the Big 12. Caleb Love is the name to remember here. North Carolina transfer from a year ago. He's now in his second year at Arizona. Arizona has a real chance to win the Big 12 in their first year in that conference. And Tommy Lloyd is bringing really good stability to a program that historically has been very, very successful once you get that ball rolling. At number 11, the Auburn Tigers. We already know that Bruce Pearl is going to have one of the best defenses in the country. And with Johnny Broome, one of the best centers, power forwards in the country, the expectations are very high for Auburn in the SEC and nationwide. They bring in one of the best transfers in the country in J.P. Peggs from Furman. Bruce Pearl's teams, you can never count them out, and I expect that to continue this year at Auburn. At number 12, the Tennessee Volunteers. They lost an epic game, I think one of the best games of last year's tournament, in the Elite Eight to Purdue. But they do return Zakai Ziegler, one of the best point guards in the country. And they also bring in 2 big-time transfers in Felix Okpara from Ohio State and Chaz Lanier from North Florida. Again, Rick Barnes along with Bruce Pearl. They are 2 of the best defensive-minded coaches in the country. I don't think Tennessee has quite as much talent as last year, but with the defense that they play, they're always dangerous. At number 13, another SEC school, Texas A&M. This is the best team that Buzz Williams has had since he came over from Virginia Tech. Texas A&M last year lost a really exciting game to Houston in the second round, hit a 3-pointer at the buzzer in regulation to send it to overtime. Houston took over in overtime and won, but Texas A&M, I believe, is hungry for another chance in the NCAA tournament. Wade Taylor IV is going to be the leader of this team, and it wouldn't surprise me if he comes out as SEC Player of the Year with his experience. You know that Buzz Williams teams are going to get better and better as the year goes on, so watch out for Texas A&M once we get to March and tournament play heading in to the SEC tournament and the NCAA tournament. Coming in at number 14, the Purdue Boilermakers. The big story here is the loss of Zach Edey, 2-time National Player of the Year, made a national championship appearance last year before losing to UConn. Edey is now gone, but they have one of the best backcourts in the country with Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer. Matt Painter got the monkey off his back by getting to the Final Four last year. He was one of the best coaches in the country to not make a Final Four, but now he has that on his resume. He can now take a deep breath and focus in on building this program without Zach Edey, and that is going to be one of the major storylines of this season, how Purdue handles that transition from having the best player of the country to not having the best player in the country. At number 15, the Creighton Blue Jays. Last year, lost in the Sweet 16 to Tennessee, another classic game. The thing that Creighton can focus on with this year's team is the return of Ryan Kalkbrenner and Stephen Ashworth. I would put Kalkbrenner on my preseason All-American team. Great big man, great defender. Greg McDermott has a way of bringing back players for multiple years and surrounding them with young, talented players that fit the culture of the Creighton Blue Jays. The Big East is wide open. Connecticut is right up there as well. But I think Creighton has a very good chance to win the Big East this year, and Ryan Kalkbrenner is the reason why. At number 16, the Arkansas Razorbacks. This ranking has nothing to do with what they did last year, which was basically nothing. They didn't make the NCAA tournament and were one of the most overrated teams when looking at talent and what they ended up doing during the regular season. But now the program has completely changed. John Calipari has come in. The lone contributor that made any sort of significant contribution to the team is Trayvon Brazile. Outside of that, this whole roster is new, and this 16th ranking is more than likely due to John Calipari and the ability of him to bring in talent and gel that talent together in a short amount of time. Arkansas does bring in John L. Davis, one of the most decorated basketball players in Florida Atlantic history, and then DJ Wagner coming over from Kentucky to join John Calipari in Arkansas. Two really good guards. The guard play there is going to be phenomenal. It's going to be interesting, though. Can that team gel quickly and get Arkansas back to where they've been in recent years? At number 17, the Indiana Hoosiers. Mike Woodson is back with a team that is loaded with some of the best transfers in the country. Last year was disappointing. They did not make it to the NCAA tournament, But this year with Umar Ballo, the big man transfer from Arizona, who many say was the biggest get, the biggest award or reward in the transfer portal, now is with the Hoosiers. Mike Woodson has no excuse at this point. It's do or die now for Mike Woodson. Put up or shut up. If he cannot get this team to the NCAA tournament, I don't see him surviving to coach the Hoosiers for another year. The fan base would be fed up, and they would be ready to move on. At number 18, the Marquette Golden Eagles. Shaka Smart, another year near the top in the Big East. He has built this Marquette program into a guard-centric program. Always great guard play, and it's no different this year. Cam Jones is going to be the star of that team. They play great team basketball, and they are going to be hungry after losing in the Sweet 16 to NC State this past season. Again, along with Creighton and UConn, I have Marquette right up there at the top of the Big East. And with the experience and the calmness that Shaka Smart brings to that program, definitely watch out for this team to be up there at the end of the year in the Big East and nationwide. 19th overall is the Texas Longhorns. Now, Texas is making the transition from the Big 12 to the SEC, and the biggest question for them will be the transition and whether it helps or hurts them overall. Big 12 being probably the best conference in college basketball, SEC being the second best. Will it matter for the Texas Longhorns? They bring in one of the best freshmen in the country, Trey Johnson. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a one-and-done player, and we see him in next year's NBA draft. They also bring in some really talented transfers in Tremont Mark from Arkansas and Arthur Kaluma from Kansas State. Rodney Terry, the head coach, has done a good job of stabilizing that program after the dismissal of Chris Beard about 2 years ago. Texas could get stuck in the weeds of the SEC, though, and it's going to be tough. If they don't win early in the conference, I could see this being a long year for the Texas Longhorns. At number 20, the Cincinnati Bearcats. Wes Miller, little by little, is building that program into a contender. They did not make it to the NCAA tournament last year. They were right on the bubble, one of the last teams out. I think they get over the hump this year. Delone Mitchell, a transfer from Texas, and then probably the best name in college basketball this year, Jizzle James, the son of legendary Indianapolis Colts running back Edgerrin James. Those two players are going to lead this team, and I believe Wes Miller has a very bright future with this Cincinnati Bearcats program. At number 21, the Florida Gators. Florida with Coach Todd Golden, one of the best young coaches in America, has this team, I believe, on the edge of really making an amazing run here over the next couple years. They lost a very close game in the first round to Colorado last year in the NCAA tournament. They returned Walter Clayton Jr. They have Elijah Martin, a hero from Florida Atlantic seasons the last 2 years, coming in. Florida is going to be a deep team. They're going to be an experienced team. They are one of my dark horses to win the SEC regular season and potentially win the SEC tournament as well. At number 22, UCLA with Coach Mick Cronin. UCLA is not used to not making the NCAA tournament. They did not make it last year. And now with the transition to the Big Ten, where does this put their program? Can Mick Cronin last another season if they don't make it to the NCAA tournament? They do bring in Kobe Johnson, a cross-city transfer from USC. It's a very rare move to see someone transfer between those two schools. And then William Kyle III from South Dakota State. Those two players are going to be the focus of this team. But Mick Cronin is on the hot seat, in my opinion, and really has a lot to do in this first year in the Big Ten. At number 23, the Kentucky Wildcats. Mark Pope takes over for John Calipari and has brought in a whole new roster. As a Kentucky fan, every single player that you're going to see on the court this year is going to be different from last year. Most notably, Lamont Butler from San Diego State and Jackson Robinson following Mark Pope from BYU. Mark Pope, in college basketball circles, is known as one of the best offensive minds in college basketball. And even though this is a brand new roster, expectations are really, really high in Lexington, Kentucky. At number 4, the Ole Miss Running Rebels. Chris Beard has this program on an upward trajectory, and this is a program, another dark horse in the SEC that I'm keeping an eye on that could make a serious run to the top of the SEC and a serious run in March. Matthew Morrell and then Sean Padula coming over from Virginia Tech, former 1-2 punch, which I think will be one of the best duos in college basketball. Keep an eye on Ole Miss. And then finally, number 25, Rutgers. Rutgers is going to be an intriguing team. They bring in my opinion, the best duo of freshmen in the country in Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey. The question I have for Steve Piquel and this team is whether or not they can rely on those two freshmen to lead this team to greatness during the season, or will the two freshmen get tired, get worn out, and not be able to do that? It's going to be interesting for Rutgers and what they can do this season, and they drop in at number 25 in the initial AP poll. So that is the top 25. In the second half, we are going to look at who I think are the top 5 most underrated, the 5 underrated, so overrated, underrated, and then 5 teams that did not make it into the top 25 that I believe will be there and deserved to be there this season.
Hi, everybody. It's John Telledge from the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast. Be sure to hop on with us to follow all the dramatic developments of the reigning American League Central Division champions. From game analysis to interviews to keeping tabs on who could be the next breakout star. We'll have that and much, much more right here. It's the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe here and join the fun.
What's up, everyone? I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Tybus Powell.
And we are your hosts of The Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need to get you through the regular season, hopeful postseason, and I'd say off-season, Tybus, but is there really ever an off-season for this team?
Thankfully for our podcast, Holly, there really never is when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Don't miss our breakdown of each week's matchup, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
Yes, they do. So hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger, Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the second half of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We're going to look at the top 5 most overrated teams, in my opinion, that made it in the preseason AP Top 25. So these are just my personal opinions. I think these teams, for the most part, deserve to be in the top 25. But where they were ranked by the voters, I think is way too high for how good I actually think they are. So, the first overrated team, in my opinion, is the Kansas Jayhawks. They are preseason number 1. The AP voters believe that they have the best chance of winning the national championship heading into this year. My concerns for them, number 1, when you look at what Kansas has done since 2022 when they won that national championship, it really has not been that impressive. And Hunter Dickinson, who people believe is the best player in the country, I don't really think he's the best player in the country. His defense is not that great. And because his defense is not that great, it really affects the defense overall of this team. Now, last year, they were number one preseason, just like they are this year, and they faded terribly as the year went on, all the way to a second-round defeat to Gonzaga. Now, I know people are going to say that Gonzaga beat a Kansas team that was down with injuries and was playing with a very short bench, but I still wonder about the depth of this team. I still wonder if the return of DeJuan Harris and KJ Adams will make that big of a difference. Is Kansas a Final Four contender? Absolutely. If you can get Hunter Dickinson to play mildly good defense, I think they are. But is this the number one team in the country? I do not believe so. And for that reason, I think Kansas is drastically overrated. The second team I believe is overrated, the Houston Cougars. Now, again, let me clarify this. I do believe that Houston will be one of the best teams in the country. They will be competing for a Big 12 championship. But I am very concerned about the loss of Jamal Shead. Jamal Shead, one of the most well-rounded players in college basketball over the last few years. Great offensive player, great defensive player, but the best quality that he had that they're losing is his leadership ability. Houston has the talent, don't get me wrong. They're going to play great defense. That's one of the staples of a Kelvin Sampson program. But without Jamal Shead, where are they going to be? I don't think they're a top 4 team. They're definitely not number 4 in the country. LJ Cryer is a great player. Can he be the leader that Jamal Shead was? I don't believe he will be, and therefore I don't think Houston deserves to be number 4 in the preseason ranking. The next overrated team I have on my list is number 11, Auburn. Now, let me just say, Bruce Pearl always has teams that play better than what their roster looks like. But when I look at this roster, outside of Johnny Broome, who I do believe has a chance to be SEC Player of the Year, and JP Peggs, the transfer from Furman, I do wonder how deep this team is going to go. Losing last year in the first round to Yale also makes me question where this program is going as well. When you look at Bruce Pearl teams, yes, they play great defense, but they get stagnant on offense, and that can really hurt them. Johnny Broome is a big man. He's going to be successful around the rim, but who's going to get them the ball, and how are the guards going to play in order to support Johnny Broome and get them success overall? I do believe Auburn will be one of the best teams in the SEC, but I don't think the 11 overall team in the country is warranted based on how they finished last year and the outlook for them, at least at the start of this year. The next overrated team is number 14, Purdue. The defending national runners-up, one of the best returning cores in the country, outside of losing Zach Edey. They return almost every single piece. So they do have that going for them, and I applaud Matt Painter for keeping that team together when so many successful teams nowadays are ripped apart by players going pro or transferring. Matt Painter has built one of the most stable programs in the country with upperclassmen and veterans that just litter this roster. But I think it has to be questioned. Yes, Zach Edey is a big loss. How big of a loss is it going to be? Will Purdue, who is projected to either win or finish second in the Big Ten this year, will they be able to hold up to those expectations? Those are very high expectations for a team that has lost the centerpiece of their roster. And we saw last year with Purdue, when Zach Edey was off the court, this team struggled mightily when it came to figuring out who the scorer was going to be on the court. Braden Smith and Fletcher Lawyer are great guards, but when they struggle shooting, this team collapses. Don't get me wrong, I think Purdue is a very good team, but I think 14 is a little bit high heading into the season. The next overrated team and the last overrated team in my 5 overrated is number 19, Texas. I do think that Texas is going to struggle with the move to the SEC. I think Rodney Terry is a pretty good coach, and he did stabilize that program, like I mentioned, after Chris Beard left a handful of years ago. But this team struggled last year. They did make the tournament as a 7 seed, so they did make it to the tournament. But this team is filled with freshmen and transfers, and I'm really worried that the culture of Texas is going to struggle this year. Trey Johnson, in my opinion, is their best player, an incoming freshman who is probably going to be a one-and-done player. Can they rely on a one-and-done player who has 1 foot in the NBA and 1 foot in college? I'm not exactly sure. And when you look at the trajectory that Rodney Terry has, yes, he has helped stabilize that program, but it seems like each year that he has been there, it's been a step backwards, and it wouldn't surprise me if that continues this year. So those are my 5 most overrated teams in the country. Number 1, Kansas. Number 4, Houston. Number 11, Auburn. Number 14, Purdue. And number 19, Texas. All very good teams. I think all those teams still will contend in their conferences, and I think all 5 will make it to the NCAA tournament. But especially with Auburn, Purdue, and Texas, it would not surprise me to see those teams fall out of the top 25 at some point this season. Let's move on to underrated teams. These are teams not necessarily that are going to compete for national championships, but based on where they are ranked, I believe they deserve a lot more respect, and the AP voters definitely did not do them credit for where I think they belong. First on my list, they were ranked number 5 in the initial AP poll, the Iowa State Cyclones. Iowa State, a Sweet 16 team from last year, I believe has the most well-rounded roster in America. Many contributors back from last year, including Tamin Lipsey and Keshawn Gilbert. They are just a full-rounded team. Defensively, offensively, TJ Otzelberger has one of the best rosters in the country. He has continually built this team into one of the best March teams as they get better throughout the year. I think Iowa State should be a top 3 team. Number 5 is fine, but I look at some of these higher teams, Kansas and Houston especially, who I had in my overrated. I think Iowa State is better. And when you look at the home court advantage that they have, I think Iowa State will go undefeated at home this year. They're going to be a tough team to beat no matter where they play. Iowa State, underrated at number 5. At number 7, the Duke Blue Devils. I do not understand how the AP voters look at this roster, look at Cooper Flagg, look at what they did last year making the Elite 8, and only have Duke at number 7. Cooper Flagg is a game changer, one of the most hyped prospects in college basketball history. They also return Tyrese Proctor. The depth on this team is incredible. The freshman class is incredible. John Shire has a program that I believe will dominate the ACC. I don't see any other team that's even close. I think they'll win the ACC by at least 2 or 3 games and roll through the conference tournament. This is a team that, unless something drastic happens, is going to be a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament, and I think it's a little disrespectful to Cooper Flagg and John Shire to have them at number 7. This should have been a top 3 or 4 team. And I think they're going to prove it, especially in the non-conference season, that they belong in the top 3 or 4. The next underrated team that I have is the Texas A&M Aggies, the number 13 team in the country in the preseason AP poll. Buzz Williams has a team, and he is a type of coach that it gets better and better every year. If you look at his tenure at Virginia Tech and also at Marquette, it's a situation where you can look at continual progress every single season. I think Texas A&M takes that next step this year. Wade Taylor not only has a chance to be SEC Player of the Year, I think he could be in National Player of the Year contention as well. Last year in the tournament, they took Houston to overtime, almost won in that game. I think Texas A&M can win the SEC. I really do. And 13 seems a little bit low to me. I think they deserve to be a top 10 team, and I think they'll prove it once we get to January and February that they are going to be in that discussion for maybe a 2 seed or maybe a 3 seed, but they are definitely low when it comes to number 13. The next underrated team on my list, and this is going to be hard to explain because there are so many questions around this team, but at number 23, the Kentucky Wildcats. Now, this is just based on the fact that there was a lot of concern, there was a lot of grumbling with the Kentucky Wildcats last year. The loss to Oakland in the first round of the NCAA tournament left a bad taste in the mouth of the fan base, and John Calipari decided it was time to move on from the Wildcats. They bring in Mark Pope, a former player, someone who loves the program, loves the fan base, and brings a lot of pride back to a program that had really struggled in the NCAA tournament the last few seasons. This program, this roster is completely new, totally transformed from last year. But Mark Pope, what he's been able to do to make over this roster has been really incredible. One of the best jobs in one offseason that I have ever seen. I think with the excitement in the fan base, with a new offensive scheme, and just a refreshing start, I think Kentucky is going to be a top 15 team by the end of this year. 23, okay, that's fine to start out there, but I don't think Mark Pope is getting enough credit for where he's going to lead this team this season. And then finally, my last underrated team in the top 25 is number 24, Ole Miss. This is based on my confidence in Chris Beard, their head coach. A lot like Buzz Williams, who you can see progress every season at a school. The same with Chris Beard. The more time you give him, the more successful he is. He did it at Texas. He did it at Texas Tech before then, and I believe he's going to do it at Ole Miss. He is one of the best coaches when it comes to bringing in transfers that fit his system and truly believe in the culture that he is building. And with the return of Matthew Morrell, I believe Matthew Morrell is one of the best leaders in the country. Keep an eye on Ole Miss. They're at 24, but I believe this is a team that will be in the top 20 sooner rather than later. So my top 5 underrated teams: number 5, Iowa State; number 7, Duke; number 13, Texas A&M; number 23, Kentucky; and number 24, Ole Miss. So that's 5 underrated, 5 overrated. And now let me look at 5 teams that were not in the preseason top 25, and maybe deservedly so, but I believe at some point during the season or by the end of the year, these 5 teams will make an appearance in the top 25, and I believe all 5 will be in the NCAA tournament in March. So first of all, McNeese State. McNeese State coach Will Wade coming in there last year, leading that team to a record of 30-4. They were a 12 seed in the NCAA tournament. They lost to Gonzaga in the first round, but Will Wade has brought in tons of talent. He's returning a lot of talent. This is a team that it wouldn't surprise me if they meet that mark of 30 wins or maybe do even better. They have a chance to have a really high record with a ton of wins. McNeese State, don't sleep on them. If you see them next to you in the first round of the NCAA tournament, that is a scary matchup. And I believe McNeese State will be in the top 25 this season and make an impact in March in the tournament. St. Louis. Now, St. Louis was not that great last year, but Josh Schertz, coming over from Indiana State, he did an unbelievable job with the Sycamores, led them all the way to the NIT championship game. One of the best coaches in America, in my opinion, after being at D2, now D1, now at St. Louis. He brings with him one of the most popular players in the country, Robbie Avila, or one of the nicknames Larry Blurred. You might remember wearing the goggles in last year's season. He is a really good player, along with being really recognizable in college basketball. I give St. Louis a lot of credit this year because I think they are going to be the best team in the Atlantic 10 Conference, a conference which I think will get 3 or 4 teams in the NCAA tournament, St. Louis being the best of those, and I believe they belong in the top 25, and they will be there at some point during the year. The third team, not in the top 25, but probably should be, the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Steve Forbes building a good program there with Hunter Salas, who could be ACC Player of the Year. I think he'll also be in contention for first team All-American by the end of the year. Wake Forest is going to be a scary team in a very weak ACC. It would not surprise me to see Wake Forest finish second to Duke in the overall standings in the ACC. They have a lot of depth from last year. Do not sleep on Wake Forest. They are a team that's going to contend, and I don't see any reason not to see them in the NCAA tournament. The fourth team, Texas Tech. Grant McCasland, I believe, is going to build that program up and have them in the top 10 in the next handful of years. But for right now, with Darian Williams returning and bringing in JT Toppin from New Mexico, I think this is a team that could rise to the top of that middle of the pack in a very, very difficult pack or Big 12. So watch for Texas Tech. Wouldn't surprise me to see them at or near the top of the standings in the Big 12 all season long. And then finally, the Illinois Fighting Illini. Yes, they do lose a lot of talent from last year's Elite Eight team. Don't get me wrong. I understand that. The Terrence Shannon Jr. was the key reason why that team made it to the Elite Eight. But Brad Underwood is one of the best coaches at building a culture and putting together pieces to fit into his system. And he's brought in 2 key pieces this year in Kylan Boswell from Arizona and Kerry Booth from Notre Dame. Watch out for Illinois in a Big Ten, which again is fairly wide open, especially with Purdue being a little bit iffy in my opinion with the loss of Zach Edey. I think Illinois could still finish near the top in the Big Ten. So the 5 teams to watch for: McNeese State, St. Louis, Wake Forest, Texas Tech, and Illinois. Not in the top 25 right now, but will be at some point during the season, and will all be scary teams to play in March in the NCAA tournament. Well, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast. In my next podcast, I will discuss who I think the national title contenders are and who I think will make the Sweet 16, the Elite 8, and the Final Four, including who wins the championship and who loses the championship. My official predictions will come up in the next episode. You all have a good rest of the day, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.